Hi everybody, I'm Dominic Moran and I'm the chair of the first session in this Carceral Geography conference. So my job is going to be to keep the presenters to time and to introduce the questions which you have the opportunity to pose in the Teams function. So the first paper of the two that we have this morning is presented by Eleanor March from the University of Surrey, and she's going to be presenting on Unlock, Constructing and Navigating Carceral TimeSpace in Prisoner Writing. So Eleanor, when you have 5 minutes left, you'll hear my voice. Also, when you have 2 minutes left, but until then, the floor is yours. Off you go.
Thank you. So the experience of prison is spatial and temporal. So according to Dominic Moran, carceral space is partitioned into nested pods of space made up of a cell located inside a prison building, positioned inside the prison walls. So for Foucault, this spatial arrangement plays a key role in the disciplinary apparatus of the prison because it keeps prisoners in a defined space and then controls their movement within that space. And then alongside this segmentation of prison space, there's a similar subdivision of time, which creates the numbing repetition of the prison routine. So prisoners are assigned to particular occupations and their movements through carceral time are controlled by the cycles of repetition of a strict timetable. And so, according to Moran, these temporal and spatial experiences are co-constitutive, combining to form what she terms carceral time space, with the prisoner serving a defined sentence within the prison space. And crucially, the prisoner's experience of this carceral time space can be characterised by both mobility and immobility, as they're removed from society in what Moran calls coerced mobility, but then held immobile within the prison. So in this paper, I'm going to be looking at how this spatio-temporal experience of imprisonment is depicted in prisoner writing, specifically short stories written by prisoners about prison. And I'm going to focus on the specific role of prison jargon in constructing carceral time space within prisoner writing. So prison has its own language, made up of three sort of main aspects: official prison jargon, prisoner slang, and orality. And I'm going to be focusing on jargon. So jargon can be defined as a private or technical vocabulary, peculiar to a trade or profession. And prison jargon covers prison-specific terms for concepts that exist outside prison, and also terms for concepts that are unique to the prison world. And in the UK, prison jargon mostly comes from official terminology that's defined by the prison service. And in particular, there's lots of acronyms and abbreviations. So in terms of the function of prison jargon, for prison officers, jargon helps staff to construct a professional persona and create a shared occupational culture, so bringing them together. Jargon also has a dehumanising function, so it makes it easier for staff to potentially treat prisoners as objects. And the use of euphemisms has also been shown to protect staff against the distress of typically unspeakable subjects such as suicide. And for institutions, prison jargon represents a deliberately veiled dual language that presents prison life in line with the ideology of the carceral system. So Goffman calls this translated ideal phrasing. For Brown and Walker, this procedural language sets up a linguistic and behavioural pattern that it becomes difficult for staff and prisoners to deviate from. So it creates a protective and defensive barrier that protects the narrative of carceral control. So as the official language of prison, prison jargon has a discursive function. So it shapes the way that we talk about prisons and prisoners and constructs our image of the carceral. So building on these ideas, I'm now going to look at some short stories written by prisoners. And in the short stories that I've researched, prison jargon tends to refer to four main areas of prison life: prison space, prison time, prison roles, and prisoner behaviour. So in this paper, I'll be looking specifically at how prisoner writers use prison jargon in their writing, focusing on the construction of carceral time space. So thinking first about prison space, the partitioning of carceral space is codified within prison jargon, as we can see from the various and many jargon terms that prisoner writers use to describe spaces of carceral confinement, such as cell, landing, spur, wing, block. So in the short story Baby Tomorrow, the narrator says he's in block 2, wing B, cell 17, a single. And this progression from block to wing to cell exemplifies Moran's idea of nested space. So although jargon is created and primarily used by prison staff, we can see that it gets imposed on and adopted by prisoners as well, becoming part of their everyday vocabulary. So this echoes Brown and Walker's description of prisoners as bilingual, in that they're able to understand official prison jargon, but also use prisoner slang as well. And similarly, the narrator of the story Charlie's Brother describes how he wants to move from the fours, the 3rd floor, to another spur of the prison, so that he can have a single, a 1-person cell, instead of a double or a 2-person shared cell. So we see here the familiar hotel-like language of single and double rooms is being reconfigured in the unfamiliar prison setting. So the reader has to learn new meanings for these terms and the carceral spaces that they're signifying. So these writers are using spatial prison jargon to construct the carceral setting for the non-prisoner reader, drawing them into the prison world. But at the same time, the authors don't give an explicit translation of what these words mean. The reader has to infer it from the context, decoding the foreign jargon and the unfamiliar geography of the prison at the same time, so that they can understand prison space. So as well as jargon referring to accommodation spaces, several of the short stories that I've studied also use prison jargon to refer to specialist spaces within the prison. There are references to reception, which is where prisoners are admitted to the prison, the lock, where prison bounds are held when they first enter the prison, and healthcare, or the prison medical facility. So these are all standard English words familiar to us, but they're often shown in title case, so in capitals, or in quotation marks, which marks them as other to the rest of the text, to show that these familiar words are being used in an uncannily unfamiliar way. So it's a bit like when words in a second language are put in quotation marks or italics. So this very strongly suggests that this jargon has to be translated for the non-prisoner reader. So once again, the writer is giving the reader the necessary information for them to interpret the meaning of jargon from the context. So prison jargon helps to construct carceral space for the reader, moving them towards the prison world. But the reader also has to work to make sense of the unfamiliar language, meeting the writer halfway. So in the short stories that I've looked at, spatial prison jargon is directly linked to the power of the prison system. And we can see this in these opening paragraphs from the story The Listener. The wing was quiet, save for the odd droning TV and a distant church that sang its 10 o'clock lament. The officer and con walk single file along the 2nd level landing, stopping outside cell 7. The officer dwarfs the man with matted hair, whose purple polo shirt has Listener emblazoned on the back. The officer unlocks the heavy door and returns the bunch of keys to his pocket with the speed of a gunslinger, allowing the door to open slightly, and the listener steps inside the single cell. "All right on your own, son?" asks the officer, eyebrows raised. "No worries." The door slams behind him and the officer's face appears briefly in the narrow glass at the top. "Okay, son, you know where the buzzer is if, well, you know." So in this extract, a prison officer is escorting a listener. That's a prisoner who volunteers by giving peer support to other prisoners. So he's escorting him to the cell of another prisoner who's having a mental health crisis. The officer and the listener move through the layers of carceral confinement, which are again described with the jargon of wing, landing, and cell. The fact that it's nighttime shows how the listener's voluntary role gives him mobility. He can leave his cell and go onto the wing, moving between these strictly defined spaces, while all of the other prisoners are, of course, locked still in their cells. So this establishes a link between the spatial and temporal restrictions of imprisonment, with prisoners typically confined within their cells as part of the rigid prison routine. But at the same time, the listener's movement is entirely controlled by the officer, who has the keys that allow the prisoner to move. And we can see the officer's power in the way that he dwarfs the listener, physically dominating the space. The extract ends with the listener locked in the cell of this other prisoner, with the officer looking at him from outside. So the officer is shown to have the power to confine prisoners, but also the freedom not to be confined himself. So in this extract, we see the juxtaposition of three main elements: prison jargon, carceral space, and institutional power. And this shows how the prison system defines the language that describes prison space, but also controls the mobility of the prisoner within that space. So the spatial prison jargon in these texts can be said to act as a synecdoche for the confining power of the prison. The prison system's control of language mirrors the systems of control in the wider sphere of prison life. So as well as using spatial prison jargon to construct the prison for the non-prisoner reader, prisoner writers also show the realities of prison life that are obscured by official prison jargon. So we see this with the term healthcare. So healthcare is a restricted, specialised space, and all of the movement in or out of that space is controlled by prison staff. So in the story Inside Out, an elderly prisoner with dementia is admitted to prison, sharing a cell with the much younger narrator, who says of his cellmate he needs to be in healthcare rather than locked in a cell. In the story The Listener that I've just talked about, the suicidal prisoner Jonesy is discharged from healthcare following a mental health crisis, but he goes on to kill himself upon release. And in The Ghosting of Alex, the title character is being moved to another prison, or ghosted, as it's called in prisoner slang. But he has a seizure and gets transferred to healthcare, where he then dies. So as readers, we're expecting that healthcare should be a therapeutic place, but these negative outcomes suggest that it's actually just another damaging carceral space that's being falsely presented as positive by prison jargon. So it's an example of Goffman's translated ideal phrasing that I discussed previously. And in fact, the prisoner Jonesy says he was transferred to healthcare because staff couldn't handle me in the SEG, the segregation unit. So this creates a continuity between the supposedly restorative space of healthcare and the restricted space of the SEG. So these writers adopt official prison jargon, but they then challenge its idealised meaning by presenting the reality to them of what the term signifies, to show the reader the punitive nature of carceral space. So within my research into these short stories, I've also seen that official prison jargon is used to describe carceral time as well as prison space. So again, we see that jargon plays an important role in categorising the segments of the prison routine. So in the story Inside Out, the narrator sits in his cell first thing in the morning, thinking about the structure of his day. He tried to think of the day ahead: breakfast, work, lunch, work, gym, association. So the first 5 words here are very familiar to us, but then we have the unfamiliar use of the word association as prison jargon for time when prisoners are allowed out of their cells to shower, make phone calls, or socialise. So association is not explicitly translated for the reader. Again, they have to infer its meaning from the context to understand how the prison controls time as well as space. So in fact, this juxtaposition of the narrator's physical confinement in his cell and then the description of the restrictive prison routine draws an explicit link between the spatial and the temporal constraints of prison as experienced by the prisoner, very neatly depicting carceral time space for the reader. And we find out more about these constraints in the narrator's description of the morning routine of unlocking cells. He could hear the bustle of the officers outside on the landings shouting and the jangling of keys. "Unlock," someone screamed. So this unlocking of cells releases prisoners from confinement, giving them a degree of mobility, but the jargon unlock is again associated with institutional power. So the jargon term is a noun that describes this part of the day, but it's also an imperative verb that tells staff and prisoners to comply with the carceral routine. And Kate Herity talks about how prison sounds represent power. So she says that the clanging of gates, the jangling of keys form part of the maintenance of power relations within the prison. So in this story, the screamed uppercase order of unlock intrudes into the narrator's cell, along with the bustle, the shouting, the jangling of keys of the prison officers. So together these act as a shorthand for the institution's control of the prisoner. So the jargon term unlock initially suggests freedom and mobility, but is then adopted and reinterpreted by the prisoner writer to express the pains of imprisonment within the restrictive carceral timespace. And in fact, quite a few short stories use jargon that imposes an idealised meaning on prison life, and we see this with the term exercise. We expect exercise to mean sport, fitness activities, but the term is actually another example of carceral doublespeak, as Noel Smith explains. The exercise yard is a bit of a misnomer, as no actual exercise is allowed on the yard other than walking. In most prisons, you're not allowed to run or jog on the yard or play football or any other sport. So exercise in this context is instead referring to the time each day that prisoners can spend outside, usually in a prison yard, rather than describing sporting activities like we might expect.
5 minutes remaining.
Thanks. So the story Time Lapse describes 7 of these exercise sessions over multiple years, and we see a group of prisoners walk or stroll multiple laps circling the exercise yard. And these sessions are all very similar, they're very repetitive, with the same words used again and again to describe the slow circular movement within an episodic narrative structure. So this repetitive slow movement isn't really recognisable as exercise, as we understand the word in a non-prison context, and embodies the monotonous prison routine. And we see similar in the story Stranger Than Fiction, where the narrator describes exercise as an hour in a small yard that takes 90 seconds to walk around even at my hobbled pace, and that's completely enclosed by a 5-metre high razor wire trimmed fence that met netting at the top. So there's even a sense that fresh air is somehow not fresh. So while the term exercise suggests health, mobility and fresh air, these writers show that in reality it signifies ill health, immobility, confinement. Prisoners are doubly confined by the restrictive space of the exercise yard and the period defined as exercise in the prison routine. And in fact, the narrator goes on to challenge the prison authorities' claim that prisoners always receive their legal entitlement to daily exercise. He rewrites their official narrative, saying that during December 2013 and January 2014, we lost 12 out of the 62 days we should have had in the fresh air. So prison not only establishes the prison routine and defines the jargon that describes it, but it also controls the official narrative of this activity. So for the reader, the familiar word exercise is removed from its usual meaning and given a new sense in prison through a process of semantic extension. Readers have to decode the new meaning of the term so that they can understand the unfamiliar prison routine that it describes, forcing them to experience a small sense of the bewildering, disorientating effects of carceral timespace. Brief discussion has shown how official prison jargon serves as a tool of carceral control, codifying spatial and temporal restrictions of prison. Jargon constructs carceral timespace for prisoners and staff. It delineates carceral spaces and also defines the ways that they can be navigated. Prisoner writers put this jargon into their writing to help describe the experience of carceral timespace to the non-prisoner reader, and jargon is used as a synecdoche for the power of the prison regime. This jargon is unfamiliar or foreign for the reader, but it generally isn't explicitly translated. The reader has to work out its meaning from the context, making sense of unfamiliar language and the bewildering carceral geography that it's describing. So because of this, I believe that in prisoner writing, jargon appears in translation as an unfamiliar language that must be decoded for and by the reader through processes of translation. And like translation between languages, this process builds a bridge between linguistic and cultural contexts, allowing the reader to understand the foreign prison language and the unfamiliar carceral experience that's being described.
2 minutes.
But at the same time, these writers don't just adopt prison jargon, they rework it. And specifically, they reveal the realities of prison life that are hidden behind this translated ideal phrasing. We actually see a similar process in post-colonial literature called abrogation and appropriation, where writers challenge the dominant language of the colonizer by adopting and then adapting it. So prisoner writers use the official language of prison on their own terms, and they explain the real meanings of terms like healthcare or exercise to show the punitive carceral time space. This means jargon also appears as translation, helping the writer to depict the unfamiliar carceral world. So in conclusion, prisoner writing describes the restrictions of carceral time space, but it can also challenge prison spatiotemporal restrictions by facilitating multiple forms of mobility. So writing lets carceral texts physically leave prison and circulate in the non-prison world. Prison jargon travels beyond the prison wall and gets translated for the non-prisoner reader. And through writing, the prisoner writer can send a small part of themselves outside prison, bearing witness to the experience of imprisonment. And by reading these texts, the non-prisoner reader must make sense of the unfamiliar prison jargon and the bewildering carceral time space, which moves them a little bit closer towards the prison world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor.
Just these are the references of all the primary texts that I cited, and that's the secondary materials.
That's great, Eleanor. Thank you so much, and particularly for keeping so well to time. So we have some questions appearing, and I would encourage everybody who would like to pose a question to do so in Teams. So the first question that I'd like to present to you is asking about the ways in which jargon works among prisoners themselves. So the question says, I was wondering in what ways you think that jargon works among prisoners in a more horizontal way rather than the top-down way that the prison exercises power through jargon. So it asks, is jargon something that is maybe also used as a way to create identity and a more communal experience, thinking perhaps in the way power works through jargon both vertically and horizontally as well? Is that something that you'd like to comment on, Ellen?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in terms of the way that prisoners use language between each other, it's very much this process of sort of appropriation and reworking that I've sort of touched on in the paper. So although the jargon is, as the question says, sort of top down, kind of imposed on prisoners, they then find their own way to use it. So even something like I talked about the use of the term seg for segregation, some of these terms get kind of reworked, abbreviated in different ways. And certainly what I'm sort of seeing in the writing is that writers are sort of using this official jargon almost in a slightly sarcastic way. You know, they have this jargon imposed on them, but they're not necessarily complying with it. They're finding ways to challenge the way that it's imposed on them. I think it's crucial to say as well that the jargon obviously isn't used in isolation. As I said, there's three main elements of prison language that I see within this writing. So we've also got slang and orality, and what we really see is those three elements kind of combine to create this very linguistically dense form of writing that's quite disorientating for the reader, and that I propose sort of is trying to replicate a sense of the sounds and discourse of prison for the reader who has not directly had that experience. So it's an approach that I think is quite disruptive. It's quite unsettling to read, and I think it's about kind of redistributing power dynamics within the prison in terms of sort of the official regime versus the prisoners, but it's also about redistributing power between the writer and the reader as well. So it very much moves the power away from the sort of the standard English mainstream non-imprisoned reader and puts it back towards the prisoner. So I think it's a quite interesting approach.
Thank you very much. So there's another question from Blurter, which I think is asking you more about what you can infer from the writing that you've studied about the use of jargon inside prison, rather than, I guess, in the answer to the question that you've just given around the purpose of using the jargon on the part of the writer for the external audience. So this question says, do you think that jargon is used on purpose, or is it something that is so ingrained in prison culture that it's just done without thought?
I think it's a bit of both. We definitely see that that language is kind of creeping in because it's the language that people are using day to day. So I talk about, you know, they're kind of assimilating it into their vocabulary. They're having to be bilingual. They're having to translate this unfamiliar language. But I think as well, there's kind of a sense that people are maybe, certainly within the writing, a lot of the writers are choosing to use this language as a technique to show kind of the power that is exerted within the prison space.
Thank you. So we have another question from Corentin Durand, who's asking about the audience for the stories that you have studied for your paper. So he's asking, are these prison terms unfamiliar to all readers? So I think trying to get you to think about how they're being received by people who are reading these stories. And I guess as an extension to that, do you think prison jargon can also be a shared cultural background within some inside and outside communities?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. So within my paper, I referred to the non-prisoner reader, and that's the way that I'm reading these texts, is considering an audience of people who do not have lived experience of prison, and the function of these texts in, I suppose, bearing witness to the carceral experience and hopefully kind of educating people about that experience. So I think certainly for those kind of readers, these terms aren't really familiar. So that has that sort of foreignizing, defamiliarizing effect that I've talked about. But yeah, I think very much for people that do have that lived experience, that there's a very different reading of these terms. And yeah, there's certainly a sense maybe of familiarity, potentially quite unsettling familiarity, I would imagine, in sort of the way that some of these terms are used. But yeah, I think one of the things I've talked about is the sense of repetition of vocabulary between these texts. So over time, as you read multiple texts as a non-prisoner reader, you're kind of building up your own vocabulary and kind of learning as you go. So there's kind of this heuristic kind of approach that's kind of yeah, moving you away from a total outsider perspective and bringing you closer to the prison world.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps just the last question before we go on to the next speaker. This is a question from Jen Turner, and she's asking you about the methods that you've used to present or to come up with the research findings that you've just presented. So she makes the point that she says presumably in order to interpret jargon you need to be able to recognise it. So you need sort of a degree of understanding in order to know what it is that you're dealing with, perhaps. So she asks, how do you approach this from a research perspective, and are there terms, jargon or otherwise, that might be unfamiliar, and those that truly cannot cross the prison boundary just because outsiders can't even know that that's what they've read, that perhaps they don't even recognise particular terms as being jargon because they're so unfamiliar?
That's a great question. And so I suppose in terms of my methodology, very much been drawing on sort of lists of glossaries of prison terminology, both in terms of slang and jargon. And really, I would say that generally, the identification was where a term did not necessarily pass for me as someone who doesn't have lived experience of prison. So yeah, absolutely, this is a subjective reading based on sort of my particular subject position. So I've sort of done my best to kind of, I suppose, educate myself and mitigate those potential limitations. I think one of the things that comes up quite often in the literature is there is no definitive list of prison jargon, prison slang. These linguistic systems are constantly evolving, and there's interplay between them as well. So yeah, it's entirely possible that there are terms that have kind of slipped through, and as Jen says, are not able to cross that boundary just because they are kind of too veiled, too kind of hidden for me as someone without that lived experience. So yeah, it's a great point.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you everybody also for your questions. And the thing that I didn't say in presenting those questions was the kind of first comment in them all was how great that paper was and how much everybody has enjoyed it, and I did too. So thank you very much indeed.